Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. My guest today, Gerard Araud, is the former French ambassador to the United States and the United Nations. I reached out to him for an interview about the U.S. election because I wanted to learn how a veteran senior diplomat from Europe is interpreting the U.S. election results. Also, Ambassador Araud has a reputation for being very blunt and direct, and after you listen to this conversation, I think you'll understand why. We recorded this conversation on the Friday following the Tuesday of Election Day, when the result was all but certain. Two things really stand out for me from this conversation. First, Ambassador Araud, and as he explains, the French by extension, have a very long view about transatlantic relations. My first question to him was about how he interprets the Trump years, and he answered by starting with George Washington. Second, I also wanted to learn from him how transatlantic relations might be repaired in the Biden administration, and he twice came back to this idea of digital cooperation to prevent the Chinese company Huawei from building 5G infrastructure in allied nations. There is much, much more in this conversation. We cover a lot of ground, from the Iran nuclear deal to the Paris Climate Accords to the personal diplomatic style of Joe Biden, and why Ambassador Araud craves a return to normalcy in U.S. diplomacy. I think we're about to enter a very interesting period of U.S. foreign policy, and I intend to focus many episodes in the coming months on various aspects of U.S. foreign policy, from the U.S.-China relations to U.S. relations in the Middle East to U.S. policy towards multilateralism, all that I seek to explore in depth with an expert on these subject areas. If there's anything in particular you are interested in learning in these coming weeks and months, please do send me an email. You can reach out to me using the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com. I'd love to hear if you have suggestions of topics you'd like me to cover or people you'd like me to interview. Just send them my way. You can also reach out to me on Twitter at Mark L. Goldberg. I always love hearing from you. Thank you in advance for sending me your thoughts. And now here is my conversation with Ambassador Gerard Araud.
Well, I think, first, I have always been convinced that there are, in American foreign policy, in a sense, there are two trends. And one that we have forgotten, but which has dominated the U.S. foreign policy since George Washington till 1945, which means the will of not interfering, not entangling the U.S. in the world affairs. It's basically the Americans have carefully avoided any international involvement, more or less till the First World War. The First World War, they went there only because they were obliged by the German actions, but they immediately left. They quickly left Europe, and they didn't ratify the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. And in a sense, if they went to the world scene, it was because they were obliged to do it. They didn't declare war to Japan. They didn't declare war to Germany. It's Japan and Germany which did it. And in 1945, they felt obliged to stay because France and the UK were exhausted, devastated, unable, in a sense, to defend Europe. And there was, of course, a global threat, or what was perceived as a global threat, which was Soviet Union and communism. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the vanish, really, and when the the threat of communism has vanished in 1991, I think the question could have been raised of why the US should remain so much committed, engaged into the world affairs. And so when Trump, in a sense, the question was raised by President Obama. People forget that President Obama, really didn't intervene in Ukraine, really intervene in Syria, but in a minimum that he could do under the maximum pressure of the allies, Arabs and Europeans, until the last moment didn't want to intervene in Libya. Mm-hmm. He withdrew from Iraq and was thinking of withdrawing from Afghanistan. So for me, between Trump and Obama, however shocking it may sound, there is also some form of continuity from the left and from the right. The idea of limiting, reducing the American commitments in the world, and which can be understandable after the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, mm-hmm. and what you can consider as their failure. So for me, again, when looking at Trump, of course, it was done in a sort of a primitive, erratic, unpredictable way. But at the same time, and I think that's part of the talent of the guy, he was also responding, I guess, to something in the country, in the United States, which is a fatigue of the Americans for international commitments. And if Biden elect, of course, Biden comes from another world because of his personal experience, but listening to the Democratic left, which will be influential in the new administration, I don't predict that the United States will go in a different way. Of course, it will be much more civilized. There will be diplomatic dialogue, multilateral negotiations, but we are not going back to the U.S. policeman of the world.
The sort of neoconservative and liberal foreign policies of, say, the Clinton and Bush era exactly. seem to have now been fully eschewed. However, beyond like military interventionism, of course, there are other aspects of U.S. foreign policy, like, democracy promotion or human rights, or, things that have traditionally and historically been associated with the United States that Trump seemed to have abandoned. And presumably, one could expect Biden to pick up where he left off. And also, speaking to you as a former French diplomat, one can expect Biden not to, trash the Europeans as much as Trump has.
Of course, really, in more simple words, I should say that we will have, again, an American diplomacy. Because what is striking is basically that for the last 4 years, we have not had a real diplomacy. Because as you know, foreign policy, you have the foreign policy, which means the president, uttering decisions or declarations. And after that, you have a diplomatic machinery which is implementing this policy. And what has been striking for the last 4 years is basically that the American diplomatic machinery has been more or less stopped or to work really. So
can you give me an example of that?
But try to define. Give me the foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy in Africa, mm-hmm. which we really, for instance, in Turkey versus Turkey. What is the foreign policy of the U.S. versus Turkey?
Versus, yeah. There was a long time where I couldn't figure out which side of the Libyan civil war the United States was supporting.
So exactly. So so we are going to go back to normalcy. Normalcy doesn't mean that we are going to agree on everything, but at least we are going to negotiate. We are going to, good example, China. It's obvious that Europeans are sharing some American concerns on China. Actually, when President Macron was in Washington in April 2018, he told Trump, he told him, he said, we agree with you. We have a problem, especially on intellectual property, market access, uh, public procurements. Let's work together. And the answer of Trump was no way, because the European Union is worse than China. And after I settle my scores with China, it will be the turn of the European Union. So obviously, we are not going to be on this line with President Biden. But at the same time, it could be complicated because I think that when the Biden administration is going to come to the Europeans and say we should work together versus China, for Europeans, it may be embarrassing because, or even awkward, because on some issues we agree with the Americans, of course. Really, on all the issues I have quoted, the World Trade Organization, the reform of the World Trade Organization, for instance, or the technology, Huawei, and so on and so on. Huawei could be a good example. We could have a transatlantic cooperation, with on the European side Nokia and Ericsson, and having a sort of a transatlantic agreement. But there are also other issues where actually we may not agree, or we may not really be ready to follow the Americans. The geography being what it is, for us, China is not really a military threat. So that will be the other difference, of course, joining the Paris Agreement on the climate change. It has been announced yesterday, I think, or 2 days ago by President by Joe Biden, which will make a big difference. Joining the Iran deal, and that will be a complicated move, but a positive one. Complicated because for two reasons. First, because the Iranians have, in retaliation, have left the agreement, so you have to bring back both sides into the agreement. Difficult also because I think, and Europeans agree with the Americans, we should handle. We had to handle the nuclear issue in isolation because it's so technical that you can't really make a sort of global deal. But you have also to handle the other issues of concern, like the ballistic activities, regional activities, terrorist activities of Iran. So that will be, and that on that Europeans and the Americans can work together, and that will be quite positive.
But I mean, let me just sort of push back on you on that. So, you're referring to the JCPOA, negotiated and signed in 2015, only to be, ripped apart by the next U.S. administration. I mean, if you're a French diplomat or a European diplomat and you've worked hard with the United States on a multilateral agreement like this, I mean, how much confidence can you have that the agreement, whatever you make, will remain in force when the next administration takes over? I mean, has the Trump administration, the Trump presidency, served as a warning to European allies that the U.S. is just not a reliable diplomatic partner?
We don't need warning about the inconsistencies of American foreign policy. Uh, but after
Speaking as
this,
someone who has served as a diplomat during the W. Bush and the Obama presidencies,
but after
yes.
this cheap shot, cheap shots are the best ones. In a sense,
I've seen you at the UN. I've seen you at the Security Council.
yeah, yeah, but
Yeah.
we don't have the choice, to be frank.
Yeah.
The Americans have launched a war because the economic sanctions, the incredible economic sanctions, without any precedent imposed on Iran by the Americans. It's really a war, actually, without shooting, but that's a war.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
And you're referring also to the sanctions on Iran, but also secondary sanctions.
yes, the secondary
that
sanction.
impacts French countries like Total and other things.
No, really,
Iran.
that's
Yeah.
it's something that uh, you are talking about inconsistency. When the JCPOA was signed, actually the Obama administration was pushing the European companies to go to Iran because the American companies were still prevented by US sanctions. So they pushed the European companies to go to Iran to show to Iran that actually there was a real quid pro quo, that they accepted the control of their nuclear program. In exchange, there was a real economic relationship with the Western world. So try to imagine the Obama administration saying to Airbus, but also not only to Total, to Peugeot, to a lot of European companies, go to Iran, go to Iran, go to Iran. They go to Iran, and 6 months later, they are sanctioned by the Trump administration because they went to Iran. So that was a low moment in the bilateral relationship. But at the
Well,
same
so
time,
yeah. Well, I
at
mean, I
the
mean that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
no, but at the same time, right now, whatever you're perfectly right. In 4 years, we could have a mini Trump. We could have Cotton. Really, we still worse. But for the moment, the reality is that the Iranians are, since they have felt freed from the obligations of the JCPOA by the American move, they are accelerating their nuclear program. So the only policy, it's very clear. The alternative we are facing, we don't want to be facing the alternative of bombing Iran or Iranian bomb.
Hmm.
So the
Yeah.
only way that we find is to negotiate with the Iranians, and negotiating with the Iranians means bringing the Americans to the negotiation. So of course there is this risk, but I think that considering the growing tensions in the Middle East, we are ready to run this risk. And frankly, I don't see any alternative.
Hmm. So just in case people missed it, you referred to Tom Cotton, the senator from Arkansas, who's kind of an arch conservative, as a mini Trump and a potential nominee for the Republican presidency in 2024. Just in case people missed it. So our conversation, and let me start again. So around the time of the impeachment of President Trump, I interviewed someone I presume Klaus Scherieth, the former German ambassador to the United States. And he shared with me an anecdote and said something with me that struck me to this day. So he was a young diplomat during the Watergate era. And what he told me is that, what emerged from his perception of the United States from the Watergate era was a profound respect for the ability of the United States to self-correct. And I'm curious to learn from you if you think that this election is a self-correction or is enough of a self-correction that might restore America's reputation in Europe.
You know, the the relationship between Europeans and the United States is so intense, and in a sense so emotional. In particular in Germany. In Germany, it's a bit striking the way the Europeans reacted to the election of Donald Trump. And the Germans were the most, I guess, emotionally struck by what was happening. In a sense, the Germans have, and I think, an understandable gratitude to the U.S. to have rebuilt uh, Germany on democratic basis after 1945, not to have nurtured any revenge at the expense of Germany. In a sense, the Federal Republic of Germany is more or less as a godfather, and the godfather is the United States. So there is really an emotional commitment. The French and the British, I guess, less emotional, maybe more cynical, really looked at it. And, to be frank, we have, countries have a long memory, and we have already
You started
had.
this conversation by citing George Washington. So,
Exactly. And
yeah.
For the French, the trauma is the Treaty of Versailles, which was not ratified by the Americans. And the fact that in 1939, in the 14th of June 1940, actually it's the day the German forces entered Paris. The French Prime Minister sent a letter to Roosevelt and saying, please help us. The democracies are defeated, and so on and so on. And there was no answer coming from Washington. And really, so again, we have some philosophy. Each country is defending its own interest. At the same time, there are so many emotional, cultural, human, and economic relationship with the US, that the US is obviously not a country like any other. But we, the French and the British, we consider that the US is defending its national interest. And it may happen that the American national interest actually don't overlap with the European national interest or with the French national interest. That's the world. There is nothing shocking, shocking. We may be in competition with the US in disagreement on some issues. We have been, in 2003, when the US launched the illegal invasion of Iraq and the disastrous invasion of Iraq, France opposed it. So it's normal, it's really. But again, having said that, we don't consider the U.S. like any country. There is behind it, two or more than 2 centuries of friendship. I love to remind people that among the G7 countries, France is the only one never to have been at war with the U.S.
I'm glad you brought up the 2003 Iraq War, which was a particularly low point between U.S. and European relations, particularly, frankly, between the U.S. and France. I mean, if some of my listeners might be too young at the time, but, they even changed the menu at the cafeteria in the House of Congress to eliminate French fries and call them freedom fries. It was ridiculous. But, France, ended up being on the right side of history there, and then you had Obama, who was able, I think, to restore America's reputation in Europe. And then you have Trump, who's once again seemed to have trashed it. I mean, are there concrete things that Biden can do to strengthen America's relationship with Europe going forward?
Oh yes, of course. It's very, in a sense, it's very simple. We are only asking for normalcy. As I have said, we are asking to have a civilized conversation with our American friends. And that's the first point. The second one is, of course, the feeling that, again, as I was referring to, we have had and we will have disagreements, but basically we are belonging to the same civilization. We are defending the same vision of the world, of democracy, for really free trade, market economy. And in a sense, also, we are facing right now a challenge to this vision. If we don't work together, Europeans and Americans, basically the Chinese authoritarian model, because there is a Chinese authoritarian model, actually will win. And it's making inroads in the third world, and also in technology. Also, Huawei is an extremely good example of what could happen if we don't work together, Europeans and Americans, and if we don't have a common policy. So first, I think the Americans have nothing to do. The election of Biden in itself is an incredible positive signal sent to the Europeans. Again, we are going back to normalcy. But after that, I suppose that we have to define a new transatlantic agenda. I think, again, basically, when you talk about the transatlantic agenda, you're talking about NATO. Russia is a pain, but Russia is not a unifying threat. I do understand the fears and historical, really rooted fears of Poland, of the Baltic states. But let's be frank, the Russia, the GDP of Russia is the GDP of Spain. And Russia is not going to overwhelm Europe. Russia is going to be a pain. So NATO is important, but it's not critical in the transatlantic relationship. So we have to reinvent our transatlantic relationship. And I think all our societies, we are going through a technological transition, which is of major interest. And I think we have to organize to have a Western management of this technological transition. The governance of the internet, for instance, the cryptocurrencies. And there are also other issues, the environment. Fighting climate change, when you ask to the business community what is the best way, and a lot of people answer carbon pricing. But frankly, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have carbon pricing different in America and in Europe. So why not to work on that? The high tech companies, the high tech companies are really an incredible opportunity, but also a challenge. Because for instance, for the taxation is based on brick and mortar. With Google, there is no brick and mortar. So the consequence is that Google doesn't pay taxes, income taxes, in Europe. So how to work together if we don't want to have a war between the US and defending its companies and the Europeans saying, oh, by the way, pay your taxes. So we have a lot, and there is a long list behind it. Really, the artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is raising a lot of ethical questions. The killing robots,
Killer robots, yeah.
and other issues. And that we have to solve to face these issues together. We belong again to the same civilization.
Can I ask lastly, Joe Biden has been around for a very long time. You have been a senior French diplomat in the U.S., the French ambassador to the U.S. while Biden was vice president. Presumably, you've had personal interaction with him and you've seen his diplomacy at work. Is there any anecdotes or stories you could share about Biden that is revelatory or suggests, something about his diplomatic style?
No, every time I was meeting him, he was reminding me that his first name was Robinet. And Robinet, it's for a French, it's very strange because it's looked like tap in a feminine way. So it's really because French tap is robinet. So
robinet, like a water tap.
Oh yeah, water tap. So in
robinet.
A feminine water tap. Well, but robinet, to be frank, robinet in French sounds a bit ridiculous, but apparently it comes from, I guess, a grandmother from Quebec or something like this. So every time, no, Joe Biden is coming from, I should say, he was chairman of the House, the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Senate. Is a sort of traditionalist Atlanticist. He believes in the Atlantic Alliance. You may also think that he's a bit a man of the past also, at a time where you were referring to one side, the neoconservatism, the other side, the liberal interventionism is more on the later, really. But the Americans have changed, and especially, especially the Democratic left. So he knows the world. He knows how important it is to have good relationship with foreign leaders. That will be actually something quite new, even compared to Obama. It's really striking that Obama was, I guess, the first American president I know who had absolutely no personal relationship with actually no foreign leader, with any foreign leader, and especially with any European leader. So he knows the importance of also this personal chemistry. So it will be, again, as I have said, it's an incredible sigh of relief in Europe to have Joe Biden as a president. At the same time, there is also worry because we think, considering the political atmospherics in the US, considering the Senate, we are a bit worried that there will be a political blockage. Really, everything will be blocked in Washington, D.C., the way it was at the end of the Obama administration. And that's never very good, especially in economic and financial terms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there are still a few Senate races to be decided. But thank you so much for your time. And I should say, as someone who has a grandmother in Quebec, mais elle s'appelle Gendreau, I appreciate the anecdote. More importantly, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much, Ambassador.
No, please, it was a real pleasure. Au revoir.
Au revoir. Merci. All right. Thank you all for listening. Merci, Gerard Araud. And as I mentioned at the outset, please do send me suggestions of topics you'd like me to cover or people you'd like me to interview. You can do so using the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com. And if you love this podcast, I would appreciate you leaving a review on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to the show. Reviews help increase the likelihood that other people who are interested in these kinds of global topics find the podcast. It's a great way to grow the podcast audience. The algorithms like reviews, so I appreciate you leaving a review. All right, we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.